So I wasn't really sure of how I was going to start this monologue, and I need to be honest. I'm a bit nervous, and I shouldn't be because I'm going to be doing a lot of reading. Back in the day, back in the day, because I'm getting old now. I remember being in matric watching. I think it might have been backstage, and there was this gent. His character name was Utandai. His real name, I think, Udini Nondumo. The way he spoke his Xhosa, man, was so beautiful to me. Fast forward, you'd reference people like Thandiswa Mazwai, of course. I mean, she was in Bongo Muffin before she went solo. Later on, we'd have Abu Zahara. Of course, the legendary icon, Kholi Hlahla, Nelson Mandela. May she rest in peace, Umamu Uprenda Fasi. So many others would inspire more of some type of a love and fascination for me with the Xhosa nation. To a point where I felt so blessed and honored to actually go and do my tertiary education in the Eastern Cape. I'd fully dive into Xhosa culture. I'd get to know the people. I'd get to know the customs. Of course, as of recently, amaXhosa love telling us how they're carrying the nation. Siya Kolisi winning back-to-back World Cups with the Springboks. Zozibini Tunzi, who's just recently gotten married, winning Miss Universe. I guess amaXhosa can sort of claim him, Trevor Noah, being half Xhosa through his mom. My favorite South African author, Zanemvula, Zakes Mda. These would be Xhosa people. Simpiwe Dana. Actresses like Brenda Nkoli. I found myself fascinated and I appreciated being in the Eastern Cape for as long as I was. Although a KZN boy, a Zulu boy, you know, I love the sport of rugby, umbhoxo, which would be played largely by the Xhosa nation outside of white people, Afrikaans people and colours. They also have a fascination and a love for cricket, being very good at cricket. So you'd see like more of the colonial influence for them. As I get older, as I study African history more, as I study my own family history, the history of amaZulu, the realization that the Zulu nation or the Zulu kingdom started with one family, which is linked to uZulu Kamalandela. From there, you fast forward to many kids coming. Then you'd have uJama, you'd have uSenzangakhona, his son. Senzangakhona would have uShaka kaSenzangakhona, who would, after being banished with his mom Unandi, at some point end up being a general of the Mthethwa empire, because the Mthethwas were huge at that time. Udingiswayo, being the king of the Mthethwas, would then help uShaka to go and claim the throne from his dad. And then uShaka then would, as we all know history, build this Zulu nation and this Zulu kingdom. However, people that call themselves Zulu are not linked in blood to uZulu Kamalandela. They happen to have been consolidated by uShaka. So anyone who's like, I'm Zulu, doesn't necessarily mean you've got Shaka's blood in you. It just means that you lived on a piece of land where uShaka ended up ruling. It's almost like claiming, I'm the person of Ramaphosa, or Zuma, or Mandela. And it just so happened that those people were the leaders of South Africa at the time. That was interesting for me. And amaZulu and amaXhosa would have this tension and this beef over the years. And I'd want to figure out how amaXhosa would come to be. Only to learn that amaXhosa, similar to amaZulu, would come together not because they are all related through blood, but through these smaller clans that would be consolidated at some point. So I went out, read some articles, put them together, and I'm going to be reading some stuff to you today. I cannot confirm that what I'm going to be reading is accurate, that it is the history. A lot of it obviously comes from Google, so a lot of it is westernized. A lot of it has been captured by our colonial settlers, the British in particular. So I urge you to please feel free to criticize, feel free to suggest, feel free to offer what you may feel is superior information so that we can all learn. But like I said, as with the Zulu kingdom, where you'd have oMthethwa, oZulu, oNdwandwe, and others, I was fascinated in trying to figure out how did amaXhosa come together and become what we know them as today. Here we go. As I start my research, these clans come up. I'm going to mention all of them. If there are any that I'm missing, I do apologize to the people that belong to them. But then it's going to be up to you guys to educate people like myself, people like your family members, your friends, etc. You've got amaNgwevu. You've got amaMpondo, amaMpondomise, abaThembu, amaMfengu, amaBhele, amaBhaca, amaHlubi, amaZizi, amaXesibe, amaBomvana. And then, interestingly, the Xhosa also include the KhweKhwe tribes, what we know as the KhweKhwe. I will be reading. I apologize, but again, this is not my history. amaXhosa are the second biggest cultural group in South Africa, after amaZulu. They account today for just under 20%, 18% of the South African population. There are over 10 million Xhosa people in total, with over 9.5 million of them in South Africa alone. Interestingly, which you may not know, there are over 200,000 Xhosa people or Xhosa-speaking people based in Zimbabwe. They were brought in by Cecil John Rhodes for cheap labor in Rhodesian mines in the early 20th century. You'll also find over 10,000 of amaXhosa in Namibia, 23,000 or over 23,000 in Lesotho, and over 12,000 in Botswana. Very interestingly, even though he is a citizen and a native of Botswana, the current president of Botswana, uDuma Boko, is actually from a Xhosa-speaking village in Botswana known as Rharhabe. A summarized history. The Xhosa people, or the amaXhosa people, are descendants of Nguni clans who settled in the southeastern part of southern Africa, displacing the original inhabitants, the Khoi and the San. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Xhosa people have inhabited the area, southeastern Africa, since the 7th century. This is now from the year 600 to the year 700. This would say to anyone that amaXhosa have been here, or at least aspects of who they are have been here for the longest time in South Africa. And some argue even before some of the other more popular Nguni nations like the Zulus. Fast forward 94, the self-governing Bantustans at the time, this is now politics, of the Transkei and the Ciskei were incorporated into South Africa, becoming the Eastern Cape province. Xhosa oral history also mentions a historical settlement called eLuhlangeni, believed to have been in East Africa, in which the Ngunis lived in for some time before they continued with their migration, which we now know as the migration south. Upon crossing mountains and rivers in South Africa, these farmers, herdsmen and shepherds brought their cattle and goats with them and absorbed the weaker San groups in the region. They also brought weapons, notably the spears known as assegais or assegais, and their shields, and would form groups or chiefdoms and kingdoms mainly in what we now know as the Eastern Cape. The royal house of amaTshawe is the oldest royal family in South Africa. They trace their ancestry back to Xhosa, which some people argue is a mythical figure who led the Nguni clans to near the Mzimkhulu River, conquering and displacing the local Khoi clan's resident. Some people argue that Xhosa is actually a name that was given to this group of people by the Khoi and the San people, saying Xhosa, the Xhosa people, who some say are the fierce people. The first rulers of a unified Xhosa federation were the amaTshawe clan, who conquered neighboring Nguni chiefdoms to form the first Xhosa federation. According to oral tradition, the modern Xhosa kingdom was founded somewhere before the 15th century by uTshawe, whom the royal clan of the Xhosas is named after, who overthrew his brother uCirha, assisted by his brother uJwaga, with the help of the amaNgwevu clan of the amaMpondomise kingdom. There's going to be a lot of these names, and it may get confusing. And I think at some point, it's probably best to just go in Google and look at some of the organograms of where these families fall in. The amaCirha clan's history includes a succession dispute between the brothers uCirha and uTshawe following the death of their father, Nkosiyamntu. Nkosiyamntu was a Xhosa king. He was the son of uMalangana or Malangane, depending on who you ask, who was the father of uTshawe. He played a significant role in the history of the Xhosa people. He was a twin and received the eldership after a trade with his elder brother, the twin brother being Nkosiyane. Now, depending on who you ask, you've got Malangane at the top. Of course, his father was, I think, I'll get you his name now. Sibisite being the father, and then from there you go to Xhosa, this figure that would come to Mzimkhulu. He'd have these kids. Nkosiyamntu gives birth to uTshawe, uCirha, uJwaga. You've got Nkosiyane. You've got, I'll tell you now the other one. Ngwangube as well. Some people now would argue that, no, let me not get to it, otherwise it gets confusing. Nkosiyamntu was part of the Xhosa royal lineage, tracing back to Xhosa, as I just explained, who was said to have migrated from Northeast Africa. Now, this is the one part which I was trying to avoid, which can be confusing. Nkosiyamntu would have a brother, and this is where you guys now must help us out so we can all learn. Unjanye, or Unjanya, maybe being a nickname for one of the other siblings, who would birth, if you were to picture it in your mind's eye on the one side, uThembu, Mpondo, Mpondomise, Mpondo no Mpondomise being twins, Xesibe, Qwati. That's now the one brother, Nkosiyamntu. Nkosiyamntu giving birth to uTshawe, Cirha, uJwaga. uTshawe, now, who's the main Dala that we're speaking about, was the heir of a minor house. He overthrew uCirha. uCirha was from the great house. Now, we'd have polygamy as Africans. Some still do. And in polygamous settings, you would have a main wife, depending on who you ask. And they would heir what is meant to be, or they would birth what is meant to be your heir, your firstborn son or your first son from the main wife. Then there would be another wife of the right house. Then there might be a third wife, fourth wife, which come from the minor houses. uTshawe would come from one of the minor houses. But following the death of his father, Nkosiyamntu, he would challenge to lead the family, challenging uCirha and making sure that he defeats him. Tshawe, who was the heir of a minor house, overthrew Cirha, who was the nominal heir of the great house, with the help of the amaNgwevu clan. Whereas Cirha was the nominal heir of the great house, and uJwaga, the heir of the right-hand house, uTshawe was apparently the heir of a minor house, Iqadi. Tshawe, whose descendants subsequently formed the royal dynasty, to which uHintsa, uNgqika, and uNdlambe all belonged. Tshawe and his army then incorporated formerly independent Nguni clans into the Xhosa kingdom. This part is very important because this now answers part of my concern of how did these people, or my curiosity, how did these people come together? And it is credited to uTshawe after defeating his brother uCirha to say, I'm going to now bring together and consolidate these other Nguni people to form this great house or this great kingdom of Xhosa. KhweKhwe tribes, or the KhweKhwe tribes, were incorporated, including the Inkwa, the Giqwa, and the amaNgqosini, both Khoi and Sotho origin. Formerly independent clans, many of KhweKhwe origin and chiefdoms in the region, became tributary to the amaTshawe and spoke isiXhosa as their primary language. The Xhosa concept of history and identity is deeply rooted in the lineage of uTshawe. His descendants, particularly the Rharhabe and Gcaleka clans, who we'll speak about later being the sons of Phalo, are considered prominent within Xhosa society. uTshawe, founder of the amaXhosa kingdom, was succeeded by a lineage that included uNcwangu, Sikomo, uTogu, uNconde, uChiwo, and uPhalo. Phalo's sons, Gcaleka and Rharhabe, further shaped the kingdom's history, leading to the division of the Tshawe dynasty into the great house of Gcaleka and the right-hand house of Rharhabe. Gcaleka's line established the great house residing east of the great Khoi River. The Khoi River would split the Eastern Cape in two, and even during the Bantustans, you'd have the Ciskei, you'd have the Transkei, split by the Khoi River. And it would be when we become a democracy in 1994 that the Bantustans would be dismantled and the Ciskei and the Transkei would become one Eastern Cape as we know it today. Gcaleka's line established the great house residing east of the great Khoi River, while Rharhabe's line formed the right-hand house located west of the great Khoi River, both of them being the sons of Phalo. In order to understand the origins of the Xhosa people, we must examine the developments of the southern Nguni, who intermarried with KhweKhwe and retained circumcision as one of the practices. For unknown reasons, certain southern Nguni groups began to expand their power sometime before 1600. uTshawe founded the Xhosa kingdom by defeating Cirha, and of course uJwaga also being one of the brothers. His descendants expanded the kingdom by settling in new territory, moving away from the Mzimkhulu River and bringing people living there under the control of amaTshawe. Generally, the group would take on the name of the chief under whom they had united. As the Xhosa slowly moved westwards in groups, westwards, if you think of the South African map, from the east westwards, they destroyed or incorporated the KhweKhwe kingdoms or chiefdoms and the San groups. Their language became influenced by Khoi and San words, which contained distinctive clicks. So all abo nabo in Xhosa actually is influenced by what we know as the Bushmen in South Africa. When you look at the lineage again, just to round it up, you've got Nkosiyamntu, born of uMalangana or Malangane, and Nkosiyamntu would then birth Tshawe, Cirha, uJwaga. uTshawe would then birth uNcwangu. After uNcwangu, you'd get uSikomo. After uSikomo, you'd get uTogu. After uTogu, you'd get uNconde. After uNconde, you'd get uChiwo. After uChiwo, you'd get uPhalo, the father of Gcaleka and Rharhabe. Gcaleka would birth uKhawuta, who birthed uHintsa, very important in Xhosa history. uHintsa would birth uSakhile, who would birth uSigcawu. And I'll just end that history there. Again, uRharhabe in the Ciskei, the right house, and Gcaleka in the Transkei, the great house. The Xhosa polity achieved political ascendancy over most of the Cape KhweKhwe, extending to the very fringes of the Cape Peninsula. This was now the movement westwards. With the settlement of the Cape by Europeans in 1652, Tandagabu 1652, Naboyan van Riebeeck, the native populations were gradually pushed eastwards because now they'd moved west towards what I guess we'd call the Western Cape. With Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch and those guys settling there, now there started being tensions and then being moved back eastwards. Until in the 1700s, the borders of the Cape Colony had pushed populations far enough east, with relations between colonialists and natives significantly broken down to create a critical mass of hostile population to resist the colonialists in the Eastern Cape. This sparked off the Cape Frontier Wars, which represents some of the longest military resistance to colonialism. The historical end result would be the containment of large portions of the Cape native population into native reserves in the easternmost part of the Cape. However, these populations would also continually serve as labor inside the Cape Colony, the Western Cape. These native reserves would be rebranded homelands in the 20th century, Transkei, Ciskei, and would only be fully dismantled in 1994, with populations moving back into the wider Cape. In the 19th century, the Xhosas fought and repulsed many tribes that were escaping amaZulu in the colony of Natal. This was during the historical Mfecane wars or clashes. Those who were accepted were assimilated into the Xhosa cultural way of life and followed Xhosa traditions. The Xhosas called these various tribes amaMfengu, meaning wanderers, and were made up of clans such as amaBhaca, amaBhele, amaHlubi, amaZizi, and Rharhabe. To this day, the descendants of amaMfengu are part of the Xhosa people, and they speak Xhosa and practice the Xhosa culture. Very important to understand that there were people that would flee from what we know as KZN today, with uShaka Zulu going on a rampage. And some of them, when they moved from the KZN eastwards, they would meet these Xhosa groups and fight with them. Some of them would maybe move back to KZN, move to other places up north, etc. Some of them would actually maybe be defeated or would just be like, look, we just want a place to live. And they would become incorporated. And today, many of them identify themselves as amaXhosa. But originally, as I said at the beginning, they don't have the blood of Tshawe. They don't have the blood of Nkosiyamntu. They come from other places and they were welcomed in and consolidated into what we know as amaXhosa today. So you may find that some of them, if you actually look at the lineage, probably come from KwaZulu, come from the Sotho nations, etc. They would be known as amaMfengu, the wanderers, when they get incorporated into amaXhosa. Xhosa unity and ability to fight off colonial encroachment was to be weakened by the famines and political divisions that followed the cattle-killing movement of 1856 to 1858. I intentionally left out the story of Nongqawuse, a prophetess who would convince many of the Xhosa people that she had had a dream where she had been spoken to by their ancestors that they had to kill their cattle and they had to stop growing crops so that they could get rid of a curse. This had to do with now the settlers fighting with amaXhosa at the time to say we need to cleanse ourselves. We need to cleanse ourselves. amaXhosa would murder. They would kill so many of their cattle. And if memory serves me correct in written history, I think over 20,000 Xhosa people would die. About 30,000 of them would be displaced because of this act of this prophetess. I decided to not include this in my notes because that can be a story on its own, because it's deemed controversial and polarizing by many people. Historians now view this movement as a millennialist response, both directly to a lung disease spreading among Xhosa cattle at the time, and less directly to the stress to Xhosa society caused by the continuing loss of their territory and autonomy by the settlers. Some historians argue that this early absorption into the wage economy, we spoke about amaXhosa working in the Cape Colony, is the ultimate origin of the long history of trade union membership and political leadership among amaXhosa people. That history manifests itself today in high degrees of Xhosa representation in the leadership of the African National Congress, the ANC, South Africa's ruling political party, in government, along with many other political parties. amaXhosa, at least in my understanding, would be the premier of the native groups that would catch on English, that would play the sports of rugby, cricket, and that would be brought into this modern capitalistic money system, working in politics, working as wage earners, and then getting into things like trade unions and politics, as we'd reference people like uTata, uNelson Rolihlahla Mandela. I just want to go down some of my notes. We spoke about the wars. Not Mfecane yet, the Cape Wars. The Xhosa Wars, also known as the Cape Frontier Wars or the Kafir Wars, were a series of 9 wars from 1779 to 1879 between the Xhosa Kingdom and the British Empire, as well as Trek Boers in what is now the Eastern Cape in South Africa. These events were the longest running military resistance against European colonialism in Africa. amaXhosa won 7 of the 9 wars, fought with under the leadership of Jongusobomvu Maqoma, who led the Xhosa people for decades, defeating British settlers in 7 out of the 9 wars fought between amaXhosa and the British. The Xhosa people themselves also had their own conflicts in between their own tribes, which led to people like Chief Nqiga and the Nqiga people seeking British assistance to take down uMaqoma. I want to go to some of my other notes because I want to speak about Mfecane. The Mfecane, also known as Difaqane, or Difaqane with an L for the Sotho people, refers to a period of intense military conflict and migration in southern Africa, primarily in the 1820s and the 1830s. It was a time of upheaval caused by the rise of the Zulu kingdom under uShaka, leading to widespread displacement and conflict among various Nguni and Sotho groups. The primary cause was the rapid expansion of the Zulu kingdom under uShaka, which led to widespread conquest and displacement of other Nguni and Sotho groups. These would be the groups that don't want to serve under this guy, uShaka kasenza ngakhona. Other factors included drought and overpopulation, which exacerbated competition for resources. So as people move, we see that today with squatter camps and other overpopulated spaces. As people move, either because they're fleeing from uShaka or because wherever they are based, there's drought, their cattle are, they start moving to these more fertile spaces, and some of them become overpopulated, or sometimes they also exploit those resources and need to move some more. The Mfecane resulted in significant demographic changes, with many people forced to migrate from their traditional homelands. It also led to the formation of new political entities, as some fleeing groups adopted uShaka's military tactics and established their own states. On another day, I'll be speaking about people like Omzilikazi, who would move up north and set up groups like the Ndebeles and the like. The Mfecane's impact extended beyond the immediate area of uShaka's kingdom, reaching as far north as present-day Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania. The Nguni word Mfecane means to crush or crushing or scattering, while the Sotho term Difaqane translates to forced migration or scattering. In essence, the Mfecane was a period of dramatic social and political transformation in southern Africa, driven by the rise of the Zulu kingdom and its impact on neighboring communities. I go back to the beginning. What puts together these Xhosa nations, Xhosa kingdom? amaNgwevu, amaMpondo, amaMpondomise, abaThembu, amaMfengu, amaBhele, amaBhaca, amaHlubi, amaZizi, amaXesibe, amaBomvana, and the KhweKhwe people. What follows from here is just a brief summary of some, not all, of these groups. The amaMfengu are a group of Xhosa clans whose ancestors were refugees that fled from the Mfecane in the early mid-19th century to seek land and protection from amaXhosa. The word Mfengu comes from the Old Xhosa word, which is ukumfenguza, which in the Old Xhosa dialect meant to wander. The Mfengu people are of a confederation of clans from the Natal province, near the Embo River. These clans include uMiya, uNdlangisa, uGatyeni, uBhele, uTolo, and the Chezi clans. These refugees were assimilated, brought into the Xhosa nation, and were officially recognized by the then king of the time, uHintsa, who I had mentioned earlier being very, very fundamental. uHintsa kaKhawuta, also known as King Hintsa Ntwecu Zanzolo Zikhali, was the king of the Xhosa kingdom, founded by his ancestor uTshawe. He ruled from 1820 until his death in 1835. The kingdom at its peak during his reign stretched from the Mbashe River, south of Mthatha, to the Gamtoos or the Gamtoos River, Gcaleka in Xhosa, in the Southern Cape. Invited to peace talks by the governor of the Cape, Harry Smith, we'd know today Harry Smith being one of the towns in the Free State, the British demanded 50,000 cattle in compensation for the 1834 war. Spoke about the frontier wars. And that uHintsa ordered his chiefs to surrender. uHintsa was then held captive under the terms, until the terms were met. uHintsa sent word to uMaqoma his military commander. uMaqoma would be a great military commander. As of recently, Fort Beaufort, one of the towns in the Eastern Cape, is now named after him. Another warrior having what we known as Grahamstown now being named after him, uMakhanda, who some used to know as uMakana. Sent word to uMaqoma, his military commander, warning him to prepare to defend their country. In May 1835, uHintsa was riding as a prisoner, guarded by a company of British soldiers led by Henry Smith. The British claim that he tried to flee on horseback, and after they caught up with him, he tried to stab Harry Smith with his spear, and it would be Lieutenant George Southey who would arrive and shoot him, eventually shooting his head while he was in a river trying to escape. uHintsa was murdered by the British on the banks of the Ngqabarha River. It was widely believed he was beheaded. It seems, according to history, that parts of his body were barbarically cut off and was subsequently sold as trophies on the streets of the settler hamlet Grahamstown, now known as Makhanda. They left his mutilated body as they headed on, claiming that they didn't have the tools to bury him. It's one of the sore points that amaXhosa count when they speak about their history and what the British did to their king, uHintsa. The Mpondo people, or simply amaMpondo, is a kingdom in what is now the Eastern Cape. It was established in 1226. The amaMpondo nation was first ruled by its founder, who was King Mpondo Kanjanya, who was born in 1205 and died in 1280, and later the amaNyawuza clan, a royal clan of the amaMpondo, by nationality referred to themselves as amaMpondo. They are related to abaMbo kingdoms and chiefdoms in South Africa. uMpondo and uMpondomise were twins. There is an ongoing argument about which twin was the eldest. The most commonly held view is that uMpondo is the senior twin. It is said that while they were out hunting, uMpondo killed a lion and refused to hand over the skin to uMpondomise, as was the custom, because the young boy would give to his elder brother, which would then have people believe that uMpondo was the eldest of the twins. The tension between the two started from that day, and uMpondo and his followers were the first ones to leave and settle elsewhere, away from their father's land. The amaMpondomise form part of the abaMbo ethnic group of South Africa, one of the few indigenous groups of Southern Africa alongside the San and the KhweKhwe, or the KhweKhwe. The formal establishment of the ethnic groups as a separate nation from the other local abaMbo. They are arguably not necessarily Nguni, depending on who you ask, but some people tend to confuse them with amaNguni because of intermarriage. Their kingdom, amaMpondomise, was established 1,000 years before the Europeans and other native tribes arrived in Southern Africa. One of their notable kings is estimated around the 13th century. The San and amaMpondomise are the earliest residents of what was later to be renamed East Griqua land, by the colonialist government of Hamilton Hope Chief Magistrate. The area of Maclear did not have Griquas or KhweKhwe descendants up until Adam Koch arrived later in the 1800s and found both the San and amaMpondomise residing and intermarrying. In fact, one of the most notable royal clans of amaMpondomise, the Tshawe or Majola clan, are descendants of the intermarriage between amaMpondomise and the San. The Mpondomise encountered colonialists migrating further inland and eastwards from the Cape of Good Hope. As a result of colloquial conquest, a majority of the amaMpondomise speak Xhosa, with the minority who are bilingual speaking Mpondomise as their home language and Xhosa as a second language. Again, we go back to what I said. You've got uXhosa, you've got Sibiside, you've got uMalangana or Malangane, who would then give birth to these kids, Nkosiyamntu, Ngwangube as well. Nkosiyamntu would have Cirha, Tshawe, Jwaga. And then one of the other kids, Njanye, I said, depending on who you ask, again, I'm open to correction, would then give birth to this other side, would then have Thembu, Mpondo, Pondomise, Xesibe. So when we speak things like the Mpondomise would speak Mpondomise and not Xhosa, it is because Xhosa would now be linked to Tshawe on this side under Nkosiyamntu. But as life would go on and as we have history today, at some point all of these guys would be consolidated together. And even though they may have different dialects, anyone who's ever spent a significant time in the Eastern Cape will know, depending on where you are, different Xhosa people or Xhosa speaking people sound differently. Similar, if you're in KZN, for example, amaZulu, depending on who you ask, also speak differently. Again, some of this linked to the Mbo people, Khona Malalanguni, and it can become complicated as you go deeper. The KhweKhwe, or the KhweKhwe, are the traditionally nomadic, pastoralist indigenous population of South Africa. All the history I've been referencing, when the Nguni people or the Bantu people would come south, with the Ngunis being some of them, the Sutus and others, they would find people that were already settled here, who had been here for a very long time. The Khwe, or the KhweKhwe, or the KhweKhwe, and the San people. The KhweKhwe are often grouped with the hunter-gatherer, San, which literally means the foragers. The accepted term for the two people combined being the Khoisan, what some people call the Bushmen. The designation of KhweKhwe is actually a kare, or praise address, not an ethnic endonym, but it has been used in the literature as an ethnic term for the Khwe speaking peoples of South Africa, particularly pastoralist groups such as the Griqua, Xirikwa, the Gona, the Nama, the Khwemana, and the Damara nations. The KhweKhwe were once known as the Hottentots, even though today this is considered an offensive term. The KhweKhwe are thought to have diverged from other humans 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. In the 17th century, the KhweKhwe maintained large herds of Nguni cattle in the Cape region. They mostly gave up the nomadic pastoralism in the 19th to 20th century. Their KhweKhwe language is related to certain dialects spoken by foraging San peoples of the Kalahari, such as the Khwe and the Chwa, forming the Khwe language family. KhweKhwe subdivisions today are the Nama people of Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, with numerous clans, the Damara people of Namibia, the Orana clans of South Africa, such as Nama or Ngosini, the Khwemana or Griqua nation of South Africa, and the Qunukhwebe or Gona clans, which fall under the Xhosa-speaking polities. The Griqua clans, the Griqua, developed their own ethnic identity in the 19th century and settled in Griqua land west. Later, they formed another independent state in KwaZulu-Natal named Griqualand East, losing their independence barely a decade later to the British. They are related to the same kinds of clan formations as Rehoboth Basters, who could also be considered as KhweKhwe people. AmaBhaca were formerly known as the Zelemus or AbakwaZelemu between the 1700s until 1830, when they were formerly referred to as amaBhaca. They are the descendants of Chief Zelemu, who lived in Pongola or Opongolo and ruled his people, who were part of the abaMbo people. Chief Zelemu shared the same ancestor with Chief Wushe by the name of Lufulelwenja. Zelemu and Wushe went separate ways in the early 1700s, and their descendants were both called amaWushe and AbakwaZelemu. It was in 1730 when their grandsons Kalimeshe and Mjoli reunited again to form one tribe that later migrated south under the leadership of Mfecane Kalimeshe. The Bhele people, or amaBhele, are an African ethnic Nguni nation. They are found in the Republic of South Africa in the KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, Free State, Mpumalanga, Western Cape, and Gauteng provinces. They are said to have traceable descendants in the modern-day kingdoms of Lesotho and Eswatini, as well as in countries like Zambia and Zimbabwe. The amaBhele are said to have originated 20 kilometers south of modern-day Ladysmith, KwaZulu-Natal, in a place called Lenge, next to a mountain where their common ancestor, uBhele, is said to have resided about 2.5 centuries ago. The amaBhele was scattered in different directions of southern Africa during the chaos of the Mfecane Wars. Many people were forced to migrate to safer areas of southern Africa. During the Mfecane Wars, the scattered tribes often tried to dominate those in new territories and left a trail of destruction, leading to a widespread wave of warfare, consolidation of other groups such as the Matabele, the Mfengu, and the Makololo, and the creation of states such as the modern-day Lesotho. amaHlubi, amaNgelengele. amaHlubi are an abaMbo ethnic group native to southern Africa with the majority in Gauteng, Mpumalanga, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Eastern Cape provinces. The amaHlubi speak a dialect closely related to the Swati language, one of the Tekela languages in the Nguni branch of the Bantu language family. The Hlubi or amaHlubi dialect is endangered, and most Hlubi speakers are elderly and illiterate. There are attempts by Hlubi intellectuals to revive the language and make it one of the recognized languages in South Africa. So some of amaHlubi would go and join and become part of amaXhosa. The amaZizi, a Dlamini clan, are a significant part of Xhosa history, tracing their roots back to the 19th century and beyond. They were part of the wider Mfengu, a group of tribes that migrated during the Mfecane and were assimilated into Xhosa culture. The amaZizi, along with other clans like amaBhaca, amaBhele, and amaHlubi, are now recognized as amaXhosa. The Rharhabe clan is closely tied to the royal bloodline of the Xhosa, with leaders like uDlomo, Mashia, and Ntsele being recognized as kings. uDlomo in particular was the son of oRhadebe, but was considered the heir to the throne of Ngcobo, a more senior house, demonstrating the complex dynamics between the Xhosa nation. The Thembu, or abaThembu, are a Xhosa nation who inhabited the kingdom of Thembuland. They were established around the 16th century as one of the Xhosa federations in the Transkeian territories. The federation was later annexed by the British Empire shortly after the death of King Sakhile. According to Xhosa oral tradition, the Hala clan migrated along the east coast of southern Africa before settling in KwaZulu-Natal. The earliest known Thembu ancestor is Chief Mbulali Kana Nanzinzaba, whose grandson, named Thembu Kantongakazi, led his people from what became the South African province of KwaZulu-Natal to Dedesi in the present-day Transkei region of South Africa. The Thembu emerged as a single political entity during the reign of uNxeko, who settled in Dedesi and was awarded chieftainship by King Togo, who later also handed him independence to form a new Xhosa state. Famous descendants of Nkxeko include members of the royal line of the Xhosa kingdom and politicians like Nelson Mandela, whose father was a reigning nobleman from a junior branch of the Amadiba clan of the kings, and Walter Sisulu. I need to close this off, and as I close this off, I want to speak about two very important brothers. King Gcaleka Phalo was the king of amaXhosa nation from 1755 to 1779. The third son of King Phalo Tshawe, he became king of the amaXhosa nation in 1755, right after his father died. King Gcaleka Phalo had three known sons: King Khawuta Gcaleka, Prince Velelo Gcaleka, and Prince Ngqoko Gcaleka. King Gcaleka Phalo tried to usurp his father's rule. An interclan war broke out, resulting in the Xhosa nation being split into two subgroups: the amaXhosa group of uRharhabe and the amaXhosa of Gcaleka. To this day, the amaGcaleka lineage is recognized as the royal house of amaXhosa. The Rharhabe house is the second senior house, the right-hand house of the Xhosa kingdom. Its royal palace is in the former Ciskei, and its counterpart in the former Transkei, being uGcaleka, which is the great house of Phalo. The Rharhabe house was founded by Xhosa warrior Rharhabe, who was the older brother of uGcaleka Phalo. And I'll close it there. One of the groups that I have not spoken about is the Mbo, which becomes another history lesson on its own. I go back to the beginning. And in going back to the beginning, I want to ask, or I want to challenge. Many of us, I am a growing man. I'm not a boy anymore. I'm not young anymore. I'm a father. Many of us have been miseducated, uneducated, and misdirected about our history. And it is important that, number one, we study as much of it that is written as possible, including history that may have been captured by British settlers, that may have been captured by what we call the Afrikaners today, the Boers, the Voortrekkers, and many other historians that would come to South Africa to capture the history. A lot of our history is oral, what I'm doing now, talking. And lots of things would be lost in translation. And to this day, a lot of the kings and the chiefs fight over who is entitled to which area, which kingdom, which chiefdom, and where they actually linked, mostly because they're fighting over money and power. As a boy who was born KwaZulu and who identifies as Zulu, or who identified as Zulu, being umlotshwa, uZitha, my father being umzwelakhe kaMsongelwa, umsongelwa kaSkhotha, I would do a deep research into my family history, into Zulu history, to uncover where the Zulu nation came from, why it is where it is today, and where we are going in the future. I urge a nation as great as the Xhosa nation to do the same. When you do this history, there are many reasons. One of them is to understand where you come from. Marcus Garvey would say, a tree with no history of its roots will not know. A people without a knowledge of their past or their history is like a tree with no roots. Know where you come from and how you got to where you are. A lot of the fights we as what we call the black nation in South Africa are misguided because you find that many of us are actually related. You find that many of us, our ancestors come from the same place. And the reason today we identify as different people is because of wars, because of drought, because of famine, because of fertile lands, because of different reasons. Our families would then move to other spaces. In other spaces, they would find conflict or they would find consolation. They would be brought in to certain groups. Where you find people like Omzilikazi giving birth to a Ndebele nation of Matabele, you realize that these come from what we know as the Zulu people. Some of amaMfengu, which now form amaXhosa, come from the Zulu nation. But also the concept of a Zulu nation only becomes a Zulu nation under uShaka kasenza ngakhona, because before that there were other clans and smaller groups before that. And it all goes up to, for many of us at least, the Nguni or Abangoni, the people that don't sin, which today we identify as the Zulus, the Xhosas, the Ndebeles, the Swatis. All of us then fall under a bigger group, the Bantu group, the people of Ntu that came from the Great Lakes. This would now include the Tsonga, the Venda, the Sotho-speaking people, and the like. Who are we and where do we come from? The Mbo people become vitally important in our history if we were to do the research on them as well and how we got here. And then understanding that even when our people of Ntu got to Southern Africa, they met the KhweKhwe, the KhweKhwe and the San. And through intermarrying and interbreeding, we now are where we are today. Settlers would come in, settle officially in 1652. They would come way before that, and they were explorers in terms of the Portuguese with Vasco da Gama and the likes before that. But today we are here, and many of us fight with each other without understanding our history. Another wish, personal wish for myself, is the understanding that all these groups that we speak of, all these ancestors that we claim, that we call out, must be Zibongo, Ituko. These are just normal men and women like me and you. They made decisions, and those decisions echo now in our current reality. What stops you, like any of your ancestors, from moving to a new fertile land? Whether it is physical land that you seek for livestock breeding, whether it is the type of land where you can build a thriving business and make money, whether it is another country somewhere abroad or somewhere on the African continent, where you say, no, we are the people of Ntu, so we come from East Africa, we come from Central Africa. We come from North. My people are from all over there. So everywhere I go is my people. And if we all agree that life started in Africa, whether it started in the great empire of Kemet, whether it started in Ethiopia, whether it started in the cradle of humankind, if we all started here, then the whole world is ours to enjoy. What stops you from moving today with your people and founding your own clan and your own group and your own nation and your own kingdom? Where one day your own sons or your daughters will fight over who should get what, and maybe they split and they create something else. One of my fears as I started doing this research was the realization that the current groups we have now, Xhosa, Zulu, Swati, Sotho, Venda, Xitsonga, etc., they serve colonial political purposes to have us split. They don't want us to unite. They don't want us to actually figure out who we are and where we come from. Shaka's created a Zulu nation and a Zulu kingdom, but that was his time. This is our time. Do we still need to recognize as under uZulu kamalandela if it can be proven we come from oMthetho, oNyambose, oDingiswayo, or we come from oNdwandwe, oMkhatshwa, oZwide, oNxumalo? And if you're from the Eastern Cape, ungazithutha isiduko sakini, uTshawe, uRharhabe, uGcaleka, uPhalo, uChiwo, uKhawuta, whoever it may be, uMalangane, Nkosiyamntu. Can you link these people? Where do you fall in and where do you want to go? Fundamentally, as human beings, the idea has always been to keep moving forward, to keep thriving, to keep winning. And if you're going to be imprisoned by a history that made sense at a time and makes sense in your understanding who you are, your roots, you need to know where your stem, where your branches, where your leaves, and where your fruit are going. You do not need to be imprisoned in people of the past who were doing what was practical and pragmatic and necessary at the time, when we are living in a different time now. Nothing stops us from creating brand new cultural groups with brand new names, named after yourself, named after your son, named after your father. Nothing stops you. You just need to have the will and the desire to create that and to create your own value system and your own practices and your own rituals so that your people can win, your family, your clan, your community, your province, your city, your nation can win. My curiosity, my frustration, especially looking at the history of black oppression in South Africa with apartheid and British colonialism, on the African continent with the scramble for Africa, which was born from the Berlin Conference, the North Atlantic slave trade with black Americans now, and every other atrocity of black people, and trying to figure out where did we go wrong? What if all of these revolutionaries, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., we can maybe even reference someone who helped fight for the revolution, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, Che Guevara, and many others. Where does Kwame Nkrumah come in? Where does Thomas Sankara come in? Where does Patrice Lumumba come in? Your Robert Mugabes, your Nelson Mandelas, your Robert Sobukwe's, your Chris Hanis, your Steve Bigos. Where do they come in? How do our cultural groups, tribes, clans, kingdoms fit into the picture? Why do we have Ingonyama Trust? Why do we have a King Misuzulu, Kazwelithini? Why do we have Utalinjebo? Why do we have a leader of the abaThembu? Why do we have these groups? Why do we have these people fighting over government stipends? Fighting over territory? Where are we going? What are we trying to do? Who are our people? Who is meant to be our people? And how do we reorganize ourselves so that we can win? Even Europeans left Europe at a time of overpopulation and struggle and being treated as second-class citizens to come and settle in places like South Africa. And even after they'd settled, they would still fight amongst each other, the British and the Dutch, leading to the Dutch leaving the Cape and moving inland to become the Voortrekkers, who would later on become the Afrikaners. Because people move. And some of us, it feels like we're stuck because we were oppressed, because we were disturbed, not just by colonialism and European invasion, but even ourselves. I reference Mfecane. And other fights in between, even by siblings. This is who we are and this is who we come from. And if you obviously have superior knowledge, we welcome it because we all want to know. We yearn for this knowledge within to figure out, why am I having these dreams? Why are my people poor? Why do I speak this language? The understanding that even when we speak English, which is a mixed masala language from other places, even Afrikaans, a mixed masala language which includes Bantu languages, Malay, and other languages. Our own languages, you like, detach Xhosa, and you're like, but your Xhosa also, you're not even originally from Tshawe. You come from somewhere else where you spoke another language, but you're beating your chest. Mina ngumZulu, angeke ungitshele. You're not even from uShaka Kasenza ngakhona, uJama, or Malandela. You're actually from somewhere else where another language was spoken. No, I'm proudly Ndebele, but do you actually know where your ancestors come from? I'm proudly Chivenda. I'm proudly Sotho. I'm the man of Mshweshwe and the Kwena and the Taung people. Do you know where those people come from? Do you know where you're going? Do you have a plan for where you're going? Because in particular for black people, Africans, we cannot be stuck psychologically imprisoned in the story of apartheid, the scramble for Africa, slavery, and be given such pathetic history that we hold on to any little piece of what feels like being African, even when it's actually not who we are and it doesn't serve us. We're not even thinking about a future, a 100-year plan, a 500-year plan, where we can see from other nations that are thriving, Russia, China, who have long-term plans. What is our plan besides fighting to figure out who we are or who we were, and fighting over being a chief in Duna and wanting to get a stipend from government, fighting over political parties and having access to tax coffers? Who are we and what are we trying to do? For some people, this type of research is very boring, very technical, very academic. But for people like myself and many others, this speaks to the core and the essence of who we are. And as I said, and as I referenced Marcus Garvey, a people without a knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. Thank you very much. And Ndiyabulela kakhulu. Penuel, the Black Pen.